Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Evaluating Processes in Public Crime Labs. We are here to discuss the solicitation, research, and evaluation for the testing and interpretation of physical evidence in publicly funded forensic laboratories. This webinar is hosted by the National Institute of Justice. At this time, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Frances Scott, physical scientist with the National Institute of Justice.
Thank you. And good afternoon, and thank you all for participating in this webinar to discuss research and evaluation for the testing and interpretation of physical evidence in publicly funded forensic laboratories. As you may know, the solicitation posted on January 7th, and it will close on April 6th. To give you an overview of what we'll be discussing in this webinar, we'll first go over the background and goals of the solicitation, recommendations for successful application, application expectations and requirements, the review process, and the application checklist. So this solicitation is intended to improve the testing and processing of physical evidence. This is research into the process, not necessarily the underlying science of the testing. This is the second year of this solicitation, and there have been several significant revisions since last year. Many of you may be familiar with another solicitation, the Research and Development in Forensic Science for Criminal Justice Purposes solicitation. That solicitation focuses on research into, among other things, emerging methods and instrumentation for eventual use in forensic science. This solicitation differs from that in that the focus is on the current processes for handling physical evidence in actual forensic laboratories. This solicitation is specifically targeted for you, the forensic science practitioner. And this brings me to the first of our polling questions, and that is, how many of you have ever considered applying for research and development funds from the NIJ? And of the 20 that answered, 2/3 of you indicate that you had considered applying for R&D funding previously from NIJ. There are two goals for the solicitation, and applicants must address one of these goals in order to be responsive to this solicitation. The first goal seeks to improve existing laboratory processes through scientific research and development. Improvements could be to efficiency, through time or cost savings, or reliability. For example, an applicant could determine what acceptance criteria for mass spectra or IR would result in an acceptable rate of accuracy, or research the best schema to use for routine drug screening. The results of such research could benefit the entire forensic science community. The second goal seeks to compare emerging methods with existing laboratory practices, again to determine if the emerging methods improve reliability, efficiency, or cost savings. This could benefit other labs who could then make an informed decision as to whether to commit to a new instrument or method. We know that there are challenges to performing research and development in the public lab. The primary mission of publicly funded forensic laboratories is processing casework. We are aware that few such labs have dedicated research divisions. In addition, to avoid supplanting, existing lab personnel generally must perform research work during overtime hours. However, forensic lab practitioners are in the best position to know the problems facing them in their processes. And so this brings me to my second poll question. So 2/3 of those who answered said they had considered applying for R&D funding, but now I'd like to ask how many of you have actually applied for R&D funding from NIJ in the past. And the results are pretty clear on this. Of the 18 that answered, only 3 have ever applied for R&D funding, and 15 did not apply. And so that leads me to question 3, which is, what is the biggest reason you have not applied for funding? The number one answer was no dedicated research unit or dedicated personnel. Tied for the second answer was fear that proposed research would be too applied and lack of internal support resources. And also another reason was the unit of government authority does not prioritize research. So this pretty much explains why we developed this solicitation with your particular challenges in mind. So we have some recommendations to overcome some of those obstacles. One significant change to this year's solicitation is the strong recommendation to hire a dedicated researcher. A postdoctoral fellow is recommended, but any scientist with a strong research background who does not have a casework requirement would be appropriate. This also provides one avenue to the NCFS recommendation that postdoctoral projects be funded to facilitate translation of research into forensic science practice. We leave the mechanism of such a position to you, contract, short-term hire, etc. By designating the lion's share of the actual work to dedicated personnel, caseworking scientists only need provide oversight and input. The research scientist can provide input into the appropriate design of the research project to include appropriate statistical power. If at all possible, we strongly encourage you to attempt to get input from such a person during the writing of your application to ensure the strength of your proposal. Another recommendation, in order to provide strong translatable research, every effort should be made to validate the research by using actual casework samples. If this is not possible, proposals should include a detailed description of how realistic samples will be generated, as the power of this research is in its translatability to actual current forensic science practices. A note on what will not be funded. As you can see, under the What Will Not Be Funded section is proposals primarily to purchase equipment, materials, software, or supplies, or to contract or purchase training, validation, or other services that will complete the majority of the proposed research project. However, a budget may include these items if they are necessary to conduct research, development, demonstration, evaluation, or analysis. So you can see the purchase of equipment is not summarily prohibited. If the proposal makes a good case that, for example, the purchase of an emerging piece of instrumentation will allow the applicant to perform comprehensive comparison of this instrumental method to existing methods, for example, comparing GCIR to IR for testing of bulk drugs, and disseminate the results of this evaluation to the community at large such that their purchases and policies could be impacted, the purchase of such equipment might be considered allowable. On the other hand, if the proposal is for effectively a pass-through requesting that an outside vendor perform validation of an existing piece of instrumentation, or if the purchase request is not contained within the framework of a strong research proposal, the proposal would likely be deemed unresponsive to the solicitation under this What Will Not Be Funded item. NIJ expects that scholarly products will result from awards under this solicitation, generally in the form of peer-reviewed journal articles and presentations at appropriate scientific conferences. The strength of this research lies in disseminating the results to the forensic science community at large. NIJ hopes that, by funding research within public forensic labs, other labs may benefit immediately from this very concrete, translatable research in their own processes. These are the requirements as outlined in the solicitation, the elements that every application must include. I encourage you to see the solicitation for guidance and details on each of these items, but I will bring to your attention that there is a 14-page limit to the program narrative, and of those 14 pages, at least 7 pages must be devoted to program design. Once applications are received, they will undergo internal and external review. We will first internally scan for basic minimum requirements. These are the program narrative, the budget detail worksheet, the budget narrative, CVs or resumes of key personnel, and proof of your forensic lab accreditation. Once an application has passed the screen for basic minimum requirements, it will be reviewed externally by appropriate peer reviewers. There will be 3 reviewers per application in most cases, and they will be drawn from both practitioners and researchers. Once the external peer review is complete, NIJ scientific staff and leadership will internally review the results, and ultimately all funding decisions are at the discretion of the NIJ director. The selection criteria upon which these applications will be evaluated are listed here. You can see they are statement of the problem, project design and implementation, which carries the most weight, potential impact, and capabilities and competencies. Reviewers may comment on the budget and the plan for dissemination to broader audiences, but these are not scored. Here's a screenshot showing the application checklist, which is found on pages 29 to 30 of the solicitation. If you want to read some tips on how to make your proposal competitive, you can read the current Director's Corner on NIJ.gov. Search NIJ.gov using the keywords Director's Corner Competitive, and it should be your first result. With that, I will open it up to questions in a moment, but first I would like to note that we have a dedicated resource to answer your questions related to the solicitation at the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, or NCJRS, and as you can see here, they can be reached via email, phone, fax, or web chat. So with that, we will open it up for Q&A.
Francis, we do have one question. First of all, you indicated that instruments are allowable. Can you give us a more direction on that if the instrument is part of the project?
Yes, so again, if the purchase of the instrument is necessary to conduct the research and the research proposal itself is strong research, then that would be allowable. However, if it's just asking to purchase the equipment, that would likely not fall within the solicitation because it would not address one of the two goals.
Thank you, Francis. Again, we have a second question. What were the previous grants that were approved for this grant?
So the list of those grants is on nij.gov, correct? And we're looking it up right now to get you the website for that. But all of the abstracts for our funded grants are posted on nij.gov, so you can see the proposals that were funded last year.
Again, in the same vein, we have a question. How many proposals will be funded?
We hope to fund all strong research proposals under the solicitation, so we do not have a set number of awards that will be made. That will be based on the available funding and the strength of the proposals received.
We have a follow-up question to the instrumentation question. Is there a limit on the purchase price for the instrument?
No.
We have a follow-up. In regard to the previous projects, many of them were very interesting to us. Are the results available or the methods developed available to us?
So those projects were just funded and just began work no earlier than January 1st of this year, so I don't imagine that they have, if we're speaking of the public lab solicitation, so those awards are only about 2 months in, and so, but it is our intention to disseminate the results of those projects as they become available on ncjrs.gov.
Again, we have another question. What is the timeline for this project?
That's a great question, and it's dependent upon the project that you choose to do. We typically fund projects that are in the 1 to 3 year range, and we would not typically fund something that was beyond a 5-year time frame.
Oh, we have another question. Regarding the postdoc, are there resources to connect us with postdoc candidates?
We do not have any. I'm sure there are resources. There are not any specific to NIJ, so that would be more within your professional organizations or within the universities near you.
Okay, we have another question. Understanding that a dedicated research is preferred, what advice can you offer for utilizing current laboratory personnel on an R&D project to cleanly avoid supplanting?
That's a complex question and goes pretty much beyond the scope of my scientific knowledge because it's more of an accounting and lawyer kind of question, and I get very nervous about answering those. So what we'll do is we'll take that and we will answer it, and it will be posted along with the webinar in a few days. It looks like we have a question about are indirect costs allowable? And indirect costs are allowable to the extent that you have a current federally approved indirect cost rate. This requirement does not apply to units of local government. If you do not have an approved rate, you may request one through your cognizant federal agency, which will review all documentation and approve a rate for the applicant organization, or Costs may be allocated in the direct cost categories if your accounting system permits. If DOJ is a cognizant federal agency, you can see the solicitation for the web link to where to submit an indirect cost rate proposal.
Okay, we have another question in the chat box. Will applicants get a plus factor if they collaborate with other accredited labs or university education programs?
Not a plus factor as such, although obviously a strong research proposal will stand a better chance of being funded.
Here we have another question. Can both recipients and subrecipients, research partners, build indirect costs into the proposal, or is there a cap?
There's no cap on indirect costs, except that they must follow the section about indirect cost rate agreement within the solicitation.
Okay, then we have another question. If the project is done in phases, what would be the requirement of each phase?
The requirement in terms of what exactly? I'm not following what the question is. Reporting. Reporting requirements are always the same. There will be semi-annual progress reports as well as a final deliverable report.
We have another question. Does the grant fund all at once, or can we divide it into several fiscal years?
Funding is released all at once in terms of its availability. So the entire project that we choose to fund would be funded at once. Drawdowns are a separate issue within that. So it can cross fiscal years. I'll give a few more seconds for anybody who's still got lingering questions to go ahead and get them typed in. I don't want to hang everybody up if we've covered the questions that everybody has right now. And again, if you think of a question after the webinar, you always have that NCJRS resource, and you'll get a speedy response to any questions that you have. All right. So I would like to thank you all again for your participation in this webinar, and please do feel free to use the NCJRS resource if you have further questions about this solicitation, and I do hope that many of you will consider applying to this solicitation. Thank you all very much.